Hi there, I'm Christina, and welcome to my podcast. Nuanced Beauty is intended to be a spot where I'll capture some varied thoughts and challenge us to hold to our opinions loosely so that we can see the beauty in others and in ourselves. I want us to dive deeper into those everyday topics or those sticky topics and thoughts that we might shy away from or bulldoze over others with our opinions. Because I think if we all thought exactly the same, there would be no need for anyone else. So let's get nuanced. Welcome back to Nuanced Beauty. Happy to have you here, and I'm excited to dive into this week's question. When was the last time you weighed yourself? As we prepare for a new year, we all often take moments to reflect on what was behind us and set goals for what is ahead of us. Whether you avoid the fervor of setting New Year's resolutions or you rhythmically embrace them, it is noteworthy to consider just how many people join a gym in January. Often, this is with the intent to drop some weight off the scale. So, what has been your relationship with the scale? The number on the scale is firmly a number, a unit of measurement that puts everyone on the same playing field to consider how they measure up to one another. You can't really argue with the number on the scale, but you can argue with what you tell yourself about what that number means. Before we dive in too deeply to my own reflection on my weight and what I think of the scale, I'd like to take a minute to note that whether you are a guy or a girl, you are young or old, small or large, we can all get stuck on what our weight says about us. Since I was young, I was in the category of overweight. I didn't think too much about this until I entered high school and I made the cheerleading team. Freshman year, it was obvious that my appearance was larger than others, but I really wasn't fixated on what the number on the scale said. That changed. As a freshman in high school, I started weighing myself every day, and I tried to eat the smallest salads I could for lunch in order to see if I could make that number drop. If only the number would drop on the scale to a smaller one, then things would be great. That season, the number did indeed drop some. But that winter, I met my boyfriend and I stopped obsessing about the scale. The weight that I had dropped returned as soon as I began eating again. And then I began neglecting what the scale had to say at all for a while. Let's fast forward the clock. It's now senior year of high school, and I have received an appointment to attend the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. This is a lesser known federal service academy where most of the midshipmen graduate and commission as an officer into the Navy Reserve. It's a 4-year military academy, and you are required to maintain fitness standards, both with the height weight standards and by passing a physical fitness test. So, as a 5'4" female, I needed to weigh under 154 pounds to not need to be taped in order to determine if I fell within the body fat standards. There was only one time while at the academy, that very first winter, as a plebe, when we had to run everywhere while we were outside, that I actually came in below the 154-pound mark. To be frank, I was mostly cynical about these standards, and I thought the circumference method that we used to determine body fat percentage was flawed because depending on who did the measurement, one could pass or fail. And I was also told, or maybe I had read somewhere, that the circumference method can be off by 5 to 8% body fat, which is a pretty substantial variance. So I mostly inched by, staying just within the body fat standards. I didn't shame myself or think something was wrong with me because I couldn't beat the measurements, but rather, I think I outwardly despised these standards and I didn't see a good reason to meet them. Fast forward again, after college and being in the Navy Reserves, I still needed to meet the fitness test. And I failed a couple seasons in a row and risked being separated from the Navy if I didn't pass this test. So I ended up taking FML leave from my professional job in order to focus for 3 months on fitness. During that time, I dropped over 20 pounds. I was running twice a day, 5 times a week. I was doing yoga a few times a week and CrossFit 3 to 4 times a week. I was also meeting with a personal trainer once a week to share where I was at and how my eating was going. I'd say at this time I was eating much cleaner than I was before, but I had a pretty bland menu. It consisted mostly of chicken, eggs, sweet potatoes, oatmeal, and avocados. Sidebar here. Don't get me wrong, I actually love all of the foods I just listed, but at the time I really lacked cooking skills and I didn't know how to season foods well or how to complement a dish with flavors like adding some radishes or some blue cheese, some mushrooms or tomato and feta, or adding some honey and maple syrup and berries. All of those things are delightful flavors, and I just didn't know how to cook. I now firmly believe that eating healthy doesn't have to be bland, but there is definitely a learning curve of spending time cooking in the kitchen to hone in on these skills and gain the experience to create a delicious meal. Now, getting back to weight and the scale. That fall, after all of my obsessive focus on my meals and fitness, weighing myself daily and charting my results, I passed my test, but I still weighed in at 168 pounds and I needed to be taped for body fat in order to pass the test. That month, I also ran a half marathon. I did this just because I had spent so much time running. I told myself, why not? And I signed up to do one. I guess you could say I still held a grudge with the scale here because I was in legit great shape and I ran a half marathon and I still failed to be within the height weight standards set out before me. Even more, when I look back at photos from that year where I had really slimmed down, I can still remember thinking that I was bigger than everyone. Today, I think, looking back at those photos, I really did fit in and I looked pretty normal. But then, when I had finally made it into a pair of jeans that had just a single digit, I still thought I was on the larger side of normal and I had a ways to go. At that time, having passed my fitness test, I returned back to work and I continued working out, doing some CrossFit and yoga, but I cut back substantially on the running and I added back in the flavorful processed foods and dining out a couple times a week. The scale did not matter to me once again, and perhaps at no surprise here, I slowly bumped back up in weight to somewhere in the 180-pound range over the next 6 months. Let's fast forward again a couple years. I wasn't paying much attention to the scale. I could tell I was gradually gaining weight, but I was definitely recompositioned from the years of weightlifting and working out. and I felt like I was carrying the weight pretty well. My husband and I were now expecting our first son, and my body was changing. Thankfully, pregnancy wasn't too intense for me. I was in the mid 190s when we found out we were expecting, and I weighed in at 212 the week before I had Zeke. I remember one midwife telling me I shouldn't gain too much weight because of how much I weighed to begin with. But then that night, I had chatted with some girlfriends and they were sharing their pregnancy stories with me. And they kind of said the opposite. They told me that I was doing pretty well for gaining so little weight in comparison to their own stories. So, again, I chose not to fixate on my weight here. I figured it was more important to be physically active than it was to worry about what the scale said. My weight continued to be on the back burner as just a number. I occasionally checked on the scale. I'd say I wasn't proud of it, but I didn't feel shameful or guilty when I stepped on the scale because there seemed to be so many other more important things on my radar, like being a mother, changing careers multiple times, both me and my husband, then learning to survive with the concerns of COVID, and then welcoming another pregnancy and healthy baby boy to our family. After that came another job change and moving cross country for an opportunity. And life was just moving full speed ahead. And there wasn't really time for the scale to take priority in my mind. It wasn't until this fall that I felt the nudge to take my weight seriously again. I listened to a podcast where this coach said something like, "We need to use the scale responsibly. We shouldn't be surprised when we don't weigh in for 3 months, fully well knowing that we aren't intentionally pursuing our health and fitness, and then see that the number has jumped a couple kilos and freak out." Now, this podcast is based out of Australia. It's called Weight Loss for Women, if you're curious. And they do their measurements in kilos over there. A kilo is about 2.2 pounds. But back to my point here, her words were resonating with me. What I was concluding is I was having moments of totally obsessing about the number on the scale. Think back to freshman year of high school and the days of needing to make fitness standards for the Navy. And then right now, I don't have these fitness standards looming over my head, and I've got all these circumstances that seem so important that to care about the number on the scale just didn't seem like worthy. I was definitely neglecting how the scale read. So, how do we strike a balance of not obsessing or neglecting? I think my latest take came from what this coach was saying. Use the scale responsibly. Allow it to be a number that teaches you a little something about yourself. Weigh in once a day or every other day and note how you feel and how you ate and how active you were that day. It can be a motivator and it can help you focus in your intentions. From this point of view, I don't need to shame myself or flat out toss the scale in the trash because of this cultural moment that is telling us that our weight doesn't matter at all. Because I think at the end of the day, my weight really does matter, but it does not have to be the master of me. It doesn't have to give me my sense of worth or create my identity. My weight is an extremely valuable gauge of what's going on in my body. For example, I recently noticed that I weigh 1 to 2 pounds more for a couple days after we have ate a big steak for dinner. I'm not a lesser person for weighing 2 pounds more, or for eating red meat, I might add. This weight actually drops off back to where I was averaging after just a day or two. And I've noticed that I'm up a couple of pounds on the days leading up to and during my period. I imagine this is due to some bloating and water weight. And then my weight drops back down to that average as my period tapers off. You see, I'm attempting to get comfortable with the long term process of making delicious whole food meals day in and day out, hitting the Y day in and day out, and seeing the scale as something that can help me pay attention to myself. By weight standards alone, I've got a ways to go to be in peak metabolic health, but I'm walking along with these intentional steps. I think we can all acknowledge that our weight is nuanced, and the process of weighing in on the scale doesn't have to be ugly. I'm going to lean in to enjoying the journey here and try to find that nuanced beauty we are talking about with my relationship to the scale. So, how about you? This week's book recommendation is a cookbook. It's called The Blue Zone's American Kitchen: 100 Recipes to Live to 100 by Dan Buettner. So, I was recently listening to an interview with the author, and I enjoyed hearing about the folks that he has studied. He works for the National Geographic, and he's had the opportunity to find the oldest populations in the world. I guess he released a cookbook a few years back that presented recipes on a global scale, and then in 2019 decided to take on the challenge of finding the healthiest cultures in America and picking the brains of chefs who have fused old world and new world styles of cooking. The author chose to present all whole food plant based dishes in this book because the majority of centenarians he studied eat a high carb diet. And high carb here is not to be confused with carbs like chips, white flour, and other processed foods, but think along the lines of complex carbs like whole grains, tubers, and beans. Now, I'm suggesting this book because I've decided to incorporate 2 to 3 recipes a week into our meal plans. I picked up the book just a week ago and I have been looking through it and kind of scheming how we're going to do that. And I very much loved the introduction, and there are a lot of very beautiful pictures of the dishes. So I figured that by April or possibly by June, if it ends up being 1 to 2 recipes a week, we will have made all the recipes and potentially gotten used to incorporating these sorts of meat free dishes into our routine. I'd say just about every meal in our house has animal meat in it. It's filling and we enjoy it. But I believe there's room for variety and continuing to hone in on our cooking skills. I hope to add some new flavors and ideas to our lineup that might stick with us beyond the next year. Thanks for listening. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you consider leaving me a review or possibly share it with a friend? And if you would like to get in touch, you can send me an email at nuancedbeauty@yahoo.com. Take care until next time.